Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere that quietly changed the way I see this world. Not through noise, not through theory, but through things that should not exist. And yet they do. A lake so pink it looks completely unreal, as if someone painted it by hand. A place in the ocean where the water seems to fall endlessly into the earth, like a hidden edge of the world. Pillars of stone rising from the ground like frozen skyscrapers, shaped not by design, but by time itself. I used to think I understood the world. I thought mountains were just mountains, rivers just water, animals just surviving, simple, predictable, explainable. But the more I looked, the more everything began to feel different. Beneath what we see, something else is happening. The ground is still moving. The ground vergescence. Continents are still colliding. Fire is still rising from deep within the earth, slowly building new land, while somewhere else, time is quietly erasing entire landscapes, grain by grain. And life doesn't behave the way we expect either. Creatures sleep while floating vertically in the open ocean, motionless, as if time itself paused around them. Entire ecosystems move like one single organism. Millions of bodies flowing together, guided by forces we barely understand. There are places on this planet where the line between reality and illusion begins to blur, where the ground reflects the sky so perfectly you can no longer tell which one you're standing in, where colors appear that shouldn't exist, glowing through water, through rock, through living things. And in those moments, something shifts, not in the world, but in us, because you begin to realize maybe the world was never simple. Maybe we just never looked closely enough. So tonight, we're not just exploring natural wonders, we're slowly stepping into a different way of seeing, a way that asks quieter questions and listens a little longer, a way that doesn't rush to explain, but chooses to feel, to notice, to wonder. Because somewhere between fire and water, between silence and motion, between what we know and what we don't, there is a version of this world that feels almost impossible, and yet it has been here the entire time. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes and let's begin. I remember the first time I saw it, not in person, but on a screen. And even then, I was certain it couldn't be real. A lake, completely pink, not tinted, not reflecting the sky, but fully, undeniably pink, like liquid color poured into the earth itself. I stared at it longer than I expected, trying to find the trick, the filter, the explanation that would make it ordinary again, but there was none. And that was the moment something subtle shifted. Because if something this strange could exist so quietly, what else had I been overlooking? What else had I dismissed simply because it didn't fit the version of reality I was used to? They say the color comes from microorganisms, tiny forms of life thriving in conditions too harsh for almost anything else. Salt levels so extreme that survival itself feels unlikely. And yet, not only does life exist there, it transforms the entire landscape into something that feels almost imagined. And I found myself wondering how many truths look fake at first glance, simply because we've never been taught to expect them. And before I could settle into that thought, there was something even stranger waiting. A place in the ocean where the water appears to fall endlessly, downward, like the sea itself is draining into the center of the earth. I remember pausing the video, rewinding it, watching it again, because my mind refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. Waterfalls are supposed to fall from land, from cliffs, from something solid, not from the ocean itself. And yet here it was, a vast illusion shaped by currents, sand, and depth, a gentle slope beneath the surface pulling sediment downward. They're just creating the appearance of a massive underwater cascade, and even after understanding it, even after knowing it was an illusion, it didn't feel any less real. And that's when it became clear, understanding something doesn't always remove its mystery. Sometimes it deepens it, because now you're not just seeing it, you're aware of how fragile your perception really is, how easily your mind can be convinced, how quickly it builds certainty from incomplete information. And then there were the mountains, or at least that's what I thought they were, until I looked closer. Tall, narrow pillars of stone rising straight out of the forest floor, separated from one another, standing alone, like fragments of something much larger that had been quietly taken apart over millions of years. From a distance, they didn't look connected to the ground at all. They looked like they were floating, suspended in mist, detached from gravity. And I remember thinking, this shouldn't exist. Mountains aren't supposed to look like this. They're supposed to be solid, continuous, predictable. But these weren't. These were shaped slowly, patiently, by water finding its way into tiny cracks, expanding them, deepening them, until what once was a continuous ridge became thousands of isolated towers, and somehow, standing there unmoving, they felt more alive than anything else around them, because they carried time within their form. Every edge, every surface, every vertical line was the result of something that had been happening long before anyone was there to see it, and will after we're gone, and will continue long after we're gone. And I think that's what unsettled me the most. Not how strange these places looked, but how normal they were to the earth itself. Nothing about them was unnatural. Nothing was out of place. The only thing that didn't fit was my expectation. And that realization stayed with me, because it wasn't just about a pink lake or an underwater waterfall or mountains that look like they're floating. It was about the quiet understanding that the world is not built around what makes sense to us. It never was. And maybe that's why moments like these feel so powerful, because for a brief second, you're forced to let go of certainty, to sit with confusion, to accept that what you're seeing might not match what you believe. And instead of rushing to explain it away, you just stay there, looking, wondering, asking yourself a simple question that feels heavier the longer you hold on to it. What else in this world have I misunderstood, without even realizing it? At some point, I stopped trying to decide whether what I was seeing was real or not, and instead, I started asking a different question. What kind of world allows this to exist in the first place? Because nothing prepared me for what I saw next. Thousands of stone pillars rising straight up from the ground, not clustered into mountains, not connected into ridges, but standing alone, separated, like the remains of something that had been carefully taken apart, piece by piece, some of them reaching over 200 meters into the sky, thin, vertical, impossibly tall for something that looks so fragile. And the strangest part wasn't just their shape, it was the space between them. Empty, open, filled with mist that moved slowly through the forest below, making the pillars look as if they were floating and suspended between earth and sky. And I remember thinking, this doesn't feel like geology. This feels like something imagined, something designed, something that shouldn't be able to form naturally. But it did, slowly, patiently, over millions of years, water finding its way into microscopic cracks in the sandstone, freezing, expanding, breaking the rock apart again and again, until only the hardest sections remained, standing where everything else had been removed. And suddenly, what looked impossible became inevitable. Because given enough time, even the most solid structures begin to separate. And what remains no longer follows the patterns we expect. But even then, it wasn't just the pillars that unsettled me, it was what came next. Because instead of adapting to the landscape, instead of walking around it, humans decided to move through it, not around, but directly through elevators built into the side of cliffs, rising hundreds of meters in seconds, glass cabins sliding vertically along sheer rock faces, as if gravity itself had been simplified into a straight line. And I tried to imagine what it would feel like, standing inside one of those elevators, watching the forest drop away beneath your feet, the pillars rising around you, silent, unmoving, ancient, while you move effortlessly through a space that once took hours or days to climb. And it felt strange, not just because of the height, but because of how easily we had inserted ourselves into something that was never meant to be easy. And then there were the bridges, if you can even call them that. Long, narrow paths made entirely of glass, and stretching across deep canyons, suspended hundreds of meters above the ground, not connecting anything essential, not built out of necessity, but existing for one reason only: to let you stand there and look down, to place yourself in the middle of something that your instincts are telling you to avoid. Because every part of your body is wired to step back, to stay away from edges, to seek stability. And yet, here you are, standing on transparent ground, seeing everything beneath you, every drop, every layer of rock, every shadow moving through the valley. And for a moment, logic doesn't help, understanding doesn't calm you. Because even if you know the structure is safe, even if you know the engineering is precise, your body doesn't care. It reacts, it hesitates, it questions. And that's when it became clear to me that there are places in this world where logic stops being useful, not because things don't make sense, but because they operate on a scale and over a time frame that we're not used to thinking about. We try to understand everything through immediate cause and effect, through human time, through what feels possible within a lifetime. But these pillars, these landscapes, were not shaped for us. They were shaped by processes that don't rush, that don't stop, that don't need to make sense to the observer. And maybe that's why they feel so unsettling, because they reveal something we don't often admit, that our version of logic is small, limited, built around what we can experience directly. And beyond that, there is a much larger system operating quietly, consistently, shaping the world in ways that don't need our approval and don't require our understanding. And the more I looked at those pillars standing there, unchanged, surrounded by mist that comes and goes every morning, the more I realized it's not that these places are impossible, it's that I've been using the wrong framework to understand them. And once you see that, once you feel that shift, you stop asking whether something makes sense, and you start asking a much more interesting question: what else exists just beyond the limits of what I think is possible? There was a moment when I thought I had finally learned how to see things more carefully, to question what I was looking at, to slow down before assuming I understood. And then I saw a hillside that looked exactly like snow, pure white, layered, soft in appearance, like winter had quietly settled across the land and never left. And my first instinct, without even thinking, was to recognize it, to label it, to place it into something familiar: snow, ice, cold. That's what it looked like. That's what it had to be. But something about it didn't feel right. The shape was too smooth, the layers too structured, the light reflecting differently, and I remember pausing just for a second, long enough for doubt to enter, and that small hesitation changed everything. Because the truth was, it wasn't snow at all. It was stone, slowly built over thousands of years by warm water flowing down from above, carrying minerals, depositing them layer by layer, forming terraces that curve and overlap, creating a surface so bright and so uniform that from a distance, it completely disguises itself as something else. And that realization stayed with me longer than I expected, not because the explanation was complex, but because it was simple, too simple. Water, minerals, time, repeating the same process again and again, until the result becomes something that feels almost artificial, almost staged, as if nature itself had decided to imitate something familiar. And it made me uncomfortable in a quiet way, because I realized how quickly I had been convinced, how easily I had accepted the first interpretation my mind offered without questioning it, without even noticing that I was doing it. And the more I thought about it, the more I began to see how often that happens. Not just with landscapes, but with everything. We see something, we recognize a pattern, and we stop looking. We assume understanding has already happened, when in reality, we've only matched it to something we already know and moved on. And standing there, looking at those white terraces filled with warm water that glows faintly blue under the surface, I started to feel something shift again. A different kind of awareness, slower, quieter, less certain. Because now I wasn't just looking at the surface, I was thinking about the process behind it, the unseen repetition, the accumulation of small changes over time. Each drop of water leaving behind something invisible at first, but eventually becoming structure, becoming shape, becoming something that can fool the eye entirely. And that's when it became clear. The problem wasn't the landscape, it wasn't deceptive, it wasn't trying to imitate anything. The problem was the way I was seeing it, the way I was rushing to understand, to simplify, to categorize, to move on. Because once you stop doing that, once you allow yourself to sit with what you're seeing a little longer, to notice the details that don't quite fit, the assumptions that feel too quick, the certainty that arrives too easily, everything starts to change. Not the world, but your relationship with it. And I began to realize something that felt both simple and difficult to accept, that I hadn't been seeing the world as it is. I had been seeing it as I expected it to be, shaped by memory, by familiarity, by patterns I've learned over time. And anything that didn't fit those patterns, I either ignored or misunderstood. And maybe that's why places like this feel so powerful, because they interrupt that process. They force you to slow down, to look again, to question the first answer that comes to mind, and to accept something that feels slightly uncomfortable at first, that what you see isn't always what is, and that the world in its quiet, consistent way is always doing more than you realize, always building something beneath the surface, always becoming something that doesn't need to match your expectations. And as I stood there watching the water flow gently over stone that once didn't exist, I found myself thinking something I hadn't considered before. Maybe I haven't just misunderstood this place. Maybe I've misunderstood how to see everything. There are moments, rare, quiet moments, where everything I thought I understood about life simply pauses. Not because something dramatic happens, not because there is noise or chaos, but because what I'm seeing doesn't fit into anything I've ever known. And I don't mean something strange, I mean so unexpected, so completely outside the boundaries of what I thought was possible, that my mind doesn't know how to respond at first. And one of those moments came when I saw them, not moving, not hunting, not diving, just there, suspended in the open ocean, massive bodies, perfectly vertical, heads pointing upward, tails drifting below as if they had been placed there, carefully, deliberately, like pillars rising from the depths. And for a few seconds, I genuinely thought something was wrong, that this was some kind of anomaly, or worse, that they were no longer alive. Because everything I knew about animals, about survival, about instinct, told me that stillness like that, in a place like the open ocean, couldn't be safe, couldn't be natural, couldn't be intentional. But then I learned something that quietly unsettled me. They were sleeping, not resting near the surface, not hiding, not drifting along currents, but fully asleep, eyes closed, bodies vertical, barely moving, for 10, sometimes 15 minutes at a time, in the middle of an environment where movement usually means survival. And I remember just sitting with that longer than I expected, because it wasn't just the behavior that surprised me, it was what it implied, that somewhere in the deep ocean, one of the most powerful predators on this planet allows itself to become completely still, completely unresponsive, vulnerable, in a way that doesn't seem to make sense, at least not to me. And I started asking questions I couldn't easily answer. How do they know it's safe? What tells them it's okay to let go like that? How does something built for precision and control, for navigation through darkness and pressure, simply stop and trust the environment enough to rest within it? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something that felt strangely familiar. That not everything in nature is driven by urgency. Not everything is about movement, about action, about constant awareness. There are moments built into the system itself where stillness is not just allowed, but necessary, where even the most adapted creatures, the most capable, the most powerful, step outside of everything they usually are and become something else entirely. Quiet, suspended, disconnected from the constant flow of survival. And that idea stayed with me because it challenged something deeper, something I hadn't noticed before, that I had assumed life, especially in extreme environments, was always about doing, always about reacting, always about staying one step ahead. But here was something that contradicted that completely. Something that showed me that even in the most unpredictable places, there is space for pause, for silence, for moments that don't need to be understood in order to exist. And I think that's why this moment affected me more than anything else I had seen so far. Not because it was visually overwhelming, but because it was quiet, almost invisible if you didn't know what you were looking at. And yet, it carried a kind of weight that's hard to explain, because it forced me to accept something simple and at the same time difficult. That there are things happening in this world right now that don't fit anything I've imagined before, things that don't follow the patterns I'm used to, that don't align with the logic I rely on, and they don't need to. They exist independently of my understanding, completely unaffected by whether I can explain them or not. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to figure it out immediately. I didn't try to reduce it into something familiar. I just stayed with it. That image, those shapes in the water, still, silent, existing in a way that felt almost impossible. And I let myself accept a thought that felt both humbling and strangely comforting. That maybe, just maybe, there are entire parts of this world, entire ways of living, entire moments of existence that I haven't even come close to imagining yet. And that realization didn't make the world feel smaller. It made it feel infinitely larger, deeper, more complex, and somehow more alive than I had ever understood before. There was a moment standing at the edge of something that didn't feel like land, not yet, where I realized I had misunderstood something so basic, so fundamental, that it almost felt embarrassing to admit. I had always thought of land as something fixed, something stable, something that simply exists. Mountains, coastlines, islands, all of it. Already there, already formed. Like a finished picture that we just happened to walk across. But that idea quietly fell apart the first time I saw it happen. Not in theory, not in a diagram, but right there, in front of me, where fire meets water, where something new begins. I watched as molten rock, glowing, fluid, almost alive in the way it moved, slowly pushed its way toward the ocean. Not rushing, not exploding, just following the path of least resistance, inch by inch, as if the earth itself was exhaling, releasing something it had been holding deep inside for far too long. And when it reached the water, everything changed. The moment was immediate, violent, but strangely controlled. The surface hardened almost instantly, turning from bright orange into solid black, like glass forming in real time. Steam rose upward in thick white clouds, hissing, expanding, filling the air with a sound that didn't feel natural. And yet, it was completely. And I stood there, trying to process what I was seeing. Because it wasn't just lava entering the ocean, it was land being created, right in front of me, not over millions of years, not hidden beneath layers of time, but now, in this exact moment. Something that did not exist a few hours ago, now solid enough to stand on, still radiating heat, still fragile, still changing, and it made me pause longer than I expected, because I realized something that felt almost too simple to be true. Land is not permanent. It is not finished. It is not something we inherit as a completed structure. It is something that is constantly being made, constantly being reshaped, constantly being rewritten, layer by layer, eruption by eruption, year after year. And I started thinking about all the places I had seen before. Coastlines I assumed had always looked the same, islands I believed had always been there, mountains that felt ancient and unchanging, and now all of that felt different, because I could no longer see them as static. I could no longer separate them from the processes that created them. The fire beneath, the pressure building, the slow movement that eventually becomes visible. And it made me question something deeper, something I hadn't considered before. How much of what I call stable is actually just slow, so slow that I mistake it for stillness. Because if land can be created this way, if entire coastlines can emerge from molten rock meeting the ocean, then what I'm standing on right now, means what I'm building on, what I'm calling permanent, is part of a process that hasn't finished yet, and maybe never will. And there was something both unsettling and strangely grounding about that realization, because it removes the illusion of control. It reminds you that beneath everything, beneath cities, beneath roads, beneath the quiet appearance of stability, there is movement, constant, unstoppable movement, shaping the world in ways that don't need to be seen to be real. And I found myself standing there watching the steam rise, listening to the crackling sound of rock cooling, feeling the heat radiating from something that had just moments ago been liquid. And I couldn't help but think, this is the youngest land on Earth. Not in a metaphorical sense, but literally. Born within hours, still becoming, still adjusting, still settling into its form. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was observing nature from the outside. I felt like I was witnessing something in progress, something unfinished, something alive in a way that doesn't breathe, doesn't move like we do, but still changes, still evolves, still creates. And that changed the way I see everything that came after. Because once you understand that the ground beneath you is not fixed, that it is part of an ongoing process, you stop seeing the world as something solid, and you start seeing it as something that is always becoming, always shifting, always in the middle of its own story. And maybe that's what stayed with me the most. Not the fire, not the explosion of steam, not even the new land forming at the edge of the ocean, but the quiet realization that followed, that nothing here is finished. Not the earth, not the landscape, not even the place I'm standing on right now. It's all still happening, even if I can't always see it. I used to think of time as something abstract, something you measure, something you count, seconds, decades passing quietly in the background, invisible, intangible, something you feel only when you look back. But that idea began to shift the moment I stood at the edge of a place that didn't just exist in time, it revealed it, layer by layer, exposed, undeniable, the Grand Canyon. Stretching farther than I could fully take in, not just wide, not just deep, but open, that felt almost unsettling, as if the earth itself had been cut open, and what lay inside was not empty, but history, not written in words, but carved into stone. I remember looking down, and instead of seeing depth, I saw layers, bands of color, each one distinct, each one representing something that happened long before I could imagine. Limestone, sandstone, shale, and beneath all of that, something even older, ancient rock from deep within the crust, nearly 2 billion years of history, sitting there, exposed, not hidden, not buried, just waiting to be seen. And that was the moment I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. Time isn't something that disappears. It accumulates, it builds, it leaves traces, and under the right conditions, it becomes visible, not as numbers, not as dates, but as structure, as something you can stand in front of, and feel without needing explanation. And I tried to process what meant, because when you're standing there looking across a canyon that stretches for hundreds of kilometers, you're not just seeing a landscape. You're seeing the result of something that never stopped. Water moving slowly, consistently, cutting deeper, year after year. Not in dramatic moments, but through repetition, through persistence, through a force so steady that it reshaped an entire continent. And what struck me the most wasn't the scale, it was the patience. Because nothing about this was rushed. Nothing happened suddenly. It was time doing what it always does, quietly, continuously, until the result becomes impossible to ignore. And then I moved further west, to a place that felt different, but carried the same message. Monument Valley. Vast, open, scattered with massive stone formations rising from the desert floor, some towering over 300 meters, standing alone, isolated, like remnants of something much larger that had once existed. And I remember thinking, these aren't mountains, not in the way I understand mountains. These are what's left after everything else has been removed. Wind, water, time, slowly wearing away the softer rock, carrying it away grain by grain, leaving behind only the hardest parts, the structures that could resist just a little longer. And standing there, looking at those formations, I began to see time differently again, not as something that builds, but as something that removes, that simplifies, that strips away everything that cannot endure until what remains is reduced, minimal, almost symbolic. And it made me pause, because between the canyon and the valley, I was seeing two sides of the same process, one revealing history by cutting into it, the other revealing structure by taking everything else away. And in both cases, time wasn't hidden. It was present, active, visible in every line, every edge, every surface, shaped by forces that don't need to be seen in order to exist. And I started to understand something that felt both simple and profound, that time is not abstract, it is physical. It is something that interacts with the world, that leaves marks, that changes form, that transforms everything it touches, and we just rarely notice it. Because in our lives, it moves too slowly to see. But here, in these places, the scale shifts, the pace becomes visible, and suddenly something that once felt intangible becomes impossible to ignore. And I stood there, looking across a landscape shaped not by sudden events, but by endless repetition. And I realized that what I was seeing wasn't just the past, it was the process itself. Still happening, still ongoing, still shaping the world in ways that I can't always perceive. And that realization stayed with me, because it changed how I think about everything else, not just landscapes, but time itself. Because if time can carve something this vast, this detailed, this precise, without intention, without awareness, just through persistence, then maybe I've been underestimating it. Maybe I've been thinking of it as something passive, when in reality it is one of the most powerful forces shaping everything around me, including the ground I stand on, the places I move through, and even the life I'm living right now, quietly, steadily, carving its own path, whether I notice it or not. There was a point in this journey where I stopped trying to separate things into categories, creation on one side, destruction on the other. Because what I began to see didn't follow that structure anymore. It blurred the line completely. And nowhere was that more clear than when I watched something rise from a volcano. Not lava, not ash, but a perfect ring of smoke, lifting gently into the air, expanding, holding its shape, almost too precise to feel natural. And for a moment, it didn't feel like I was looking at something violent. It felt controlled, deliberate, almost calm. And that's what made it so unsettling, because this was Mount Etna, one of the most active volcanoes on Earth, a place defined by eruption, by pressure, by the constant release of energy from deep within the planet. And yet, here it was, producing something that looked almost delicate, a perfect circle forming from chaos, gas escaping through a narrow vent, spinning as it rises, shaping itself into something that feels almost intentional. And I remember watching it drift upward, slowly stretching, thinning, until it dissolved into the sky. And I couldn't help but think, how can something so destructive create something so precise? How can the same force that melts rock, that reshapes entire landscapes, also produce something that looks so controlled, so symmetrical, so unexpectedly beautiful? And that question stayed with me because it challenged the way I had been thinking about nature. I had been separating things, labeling them. This is dangerous, this is safe, this creates, this destroys. But here, those categories didn't hold anymore. They collapsed into something more complex, something less comfortable, because the same process, the same pressure, the same movement beneath the surface was responsible for both. And then I saw another version of that same idea, but expressed in a completely different way. Not with fire, not with heat, but with something that looked almost quiet, almost harmless. Small mounds rising from the ground, scattered across a dry landscape, their shapes unmistakably similar to volcanoes, but instead of lava, there was mud, thick, gray, slowly bubbling to the surface, pushed upward by gas trapped beneath layers of sediment. And I remember thinking, this feels familiar, but also completely different, because there was no heat, no eruption in the way I expected, just pressure, building slowly, forcing its way upward, carrying the earth itself to the surface and releasing it in a form that feels almost gentle compared to what I had seen before. And yet, the process behind it wasn't so different. Gas accumulating, pressure increasing, eventually reaching a point where it has to escape, and whether it emerges as fire or as mud, the underlying force remains the same. And that's when it became clear what I had been calling destruction, what I had been labeling as dangerous, wasn't separate from creation at all. It was part of the same system, the same movement, the same cycle playing out in different forms. Because when pressure builds, something has to change, something has to move, something has to be released. And in that release, new structures form, new surfaces appear, new landscapes begin to take shape, even if the process itself looks chaotic, even if it feels violent from the outside. And I started to realize something that felt both unsettling and strangely balanced, that the earth doesn't distinguish between building and breaking. It doesn't decide when to create and when to destroy. It simply moves. It responds to forces. It follows processes that don't carry intention in the way we understand it. And the results, whether they appear beautiful or destructive, are just different expressions of the same underlying system. And standing there, thinking about the smoke rings dissolving into the sky, the mud slowly spilling over the edges of those small volcanoes, I began to feel a shift in how I interpret what I'm seeing. Because now, I couldn't look at something like an eruption and see only danger. I couldn't look at something like a calm landscape and assume stability, because beneath both, there is movement, there is pressure, there is a process unfolding that doesn't stop, that doesn't choose sides, that doesn't separate outcomes into categories that make sense to us. And maybe that's what makes it so difficult to fully understand, because we're used to thinking in opposites. Creation versus destruction, beauty versus danger, order versus chaos. But the earth doesn't operate that way, okay? It exists somewhere in between, constantly shifting, constantly transforming, where one moment can hold both creation and destruction at the same time. And I found myself thinking, maybe the mistake isn't in what we see. Maybe it's in how we interpret it. Because once you stop trying to divide these forces, once you allow them to exist as part of the same process, something changes. Not in the landscape, but in your perception of it. And suddenly, what once felt contradictory begins to feel complete, part of a system that doesn't need to be simplified in order to be understood, and doesn't need to be understood in order to exist. There was a moment, quiet, almost easy to overlook, where everything I had been seeing up to that point began to come together, not as separate events, not as isolated phenomena, but as part of something continuous, something that had never stopped moving. And it happened when I looked at a mountain that shouldn't have looked the way it did. Layers of red, yellow, green, purple, stacked across its surface in clean horizontal bands, colors so vivid, so sharply defined that it felt almost artificial, as if the mountain had been painted deliberately, carefully by something outside the natural world. And I remember thinking, this must have always been here, something this striking, something this visible. It couldn't just appear suddenly. It must have existed like this for as long as the mountain itself. But that assumption didn't last very long, because the truth was something I hadn't expected. For most of its existence, none of those colors were visible at all. The entire mountain had been buried beneath layers of snow and ice, covered, existing in a form completely different from what I was seeing now. And only recently, as temperatures changed. As glaciers began to retreat, did those layers begin to reveal themselves, slowly, gradually, exposing something that had always been there, but had never been seen. And that realization stayed with me, because it shifted something fundamental in how I understood the world. I had been thinking of landscapes as fixed, as complete, as something that once formed simply remained. But this mountain challenged that idea completely. Because what I was looking at wasn't just a place, it was a moment, a temporary state, a version of the landscape that exists only under certain conditions, at a specific point in time, and will eventually change again, maybe becoming something else entirely. And that thought felt both fascinating and slightly unsettling, because it meant what I was seeing, what I was experiencing, wasn't permanent. It wasn't final. It wasn't even stable in the way I had always assumed. It was part of an ongoing process, something that had been hidden, revealed, and will continue to transform long after I'm gone. And I started thinking about how often I've looked at the world and assumed stillness, assumed that what I see today is what has always been, that mountains remain, that landscapes endure unchanged, that the ground beneath me is solid in more than just a physical sense. But now, that assumption felt fragile, because if something as massive as a mountain can change its appearance so dramatically, not through sudden events, but through slow, almost invisible shifts, then what else around me is in the process of becoming something different without me even noticing. And I began to see movement everywhere. Not obvious movement. Not the kind that demands attention, but subtle, persistent change. The kind that happens too slowly for us to perceive in real time, but becomes undeniable when viewed across longer spans. And that's when it became clear the Earth is not something that occasionally changes. It is something that is always changing, constantly, continuously, without pause. And the idea of stillness, the idea that anything here is truly fixed, is more of a perception than a reality, because we measure time in ways that make slow change feel invisible. We live within a scale where decades feel long, where centuries feel distant. But for the Earth, those spans are barely moments, brief intervals in a process that doesn't stop. And I found myself standing there, looking at those colors, knowing they had been hidden for so long, knowing they would not remain visible forever, and realizing that what I was witnessing was not just a place, but a transition, a brief window where something unseen becomes visible, where a hidden structure reveals itself before eventually changing again. And that made me think about everything I had seen so far, the land forming at the edge of the ocean, the canyons carved by water, the pillars shaped by erosion, the smoke rings rising from volcanic vents, the mud slowly pushed to the surface, all of it part of the same pattern, different expressions of the same underlying truth, that nothing here is finished, nothing here is static. Everything is in motion, whether we notice it or not. And That realization didn't come as a sudden shock. It settled in slowly, like something I had always known, but never fully understood. Because once you see it, once you recognize that change is not an event, but a constant, it becomes impossible to look at the world the same way again. And I couldn't help but think, maybe the earth has never been still. Not for a second, not in any moment we could define. Maybe what we call stability, what we call permanence, is just change moving slowly enough that we mistake it for stillness. And maybe that's why places like this feel so powerful, because they reveal that illusion. They show us something we're not used to seeing. Not because it's rare, but because it's usually too slow to notice. And standing there, looking at a mountain that had only recently revealed its true colors, I realized something that felt both simple and profound, that the world is not something we observe as it is. It's something we encounter at a specific moment in its continuous transformation, and what we see is just one frame in a process that never pauses, never settles, never stands still, even when it feels like it does. There was a time when I believed I understood how animals behave, at least in a general sense: survival, movement, awareness, everything driven by instinct, everything shaped by the need to stay alive. And for a while, that idea felt enough, simple, clean, predictable. But then I started seeing things that didn't quite fit, small moments at first, easy to dismiss, until they began to repeat, until they became impossible to ignore. And one of those moments came when I saw them again. Whales, massive, silent, suspended in the open ocean, not moving, not diving, not feeding, just there, vertical, motionless, as if something had paused them mid-existence. And even though I had already seen it before, it still didn't feel right, because everything I thought I knew about survival told me this shouldn't happen. Well, not in open water, not in a place where movement means awareness, where awareness means survival. And yet, they remained still for minutes at a time, completely disengaged from everything around them. And I kept asking the same question. Why? Why would something built for precision, for navigation in darkness, for hunting in extreme conditions, choose to become completely still, completely vulnerable, in a place where vulnerability doesn't seem like an option? And no matter how many times I revisited it, no matter how many explanations I understood, the feeling didn't change. Because understanding the mechanism, knowing that they shut down half their brain, that they drift in controlled states, didn't remove the deeper question. It only made it more complicated, because now it wasn't just what they were doing. It was how something so adapted, so refined by evolution, could include stillness as part of its survival. And then there was something else, something that felt completely different, and yet carried the same kind of confusion. I watched as the sky began to move, not with clouds, not with wind, but with something alive, a continuous stream, dark against the fading light, stretching across the horizon like a living ribbon. And it took a moment to understand what I was seeing. Millions of bats, leaving a cave all at once, not scattered, not chaotic, but organized, flowing together in patterns that seemed almost intentional, shifting, folding, expanding, contracting, as if the entire mass was responding to something invisible, something shared. And I stood there, watching this movement unfold, and again, the same question returned: why? Why do they move like this? Why not leave in smaller groups? Why create something so visible, so concentrated, something that feels almost like a signal rather than a necessity? And the more I watched, the more I realized that I wasn't seeing individual animals anymore. I was seeing a system, something larger than the sum of its parts. Each movement influenced by the others, each shift creating a new pattern, and for a moment, it didn't feel like behavior. It felt like structure, like something closer to a living organism than a collection of individuals. And that's when it became clear. The problem wasn't that these behaviors didn't make sense. The problem was that I was trying to understand them from the wrong perspective. I had been thinking in terms of individuals, of singular actions, of isolated decisions. But what I was seeing operated on a completely different level, something collective, something emergent, something that doesn't rely on a single point of control. And that realization stayed with me because it forced me to question something deeper. How much of life have I misunderstood simply because I've been looking at it too narrowly? I'm trying to fit it into patterns that make sense at a human scale, when in reality, it operates across layers, across systems, across interactions that don't reveal themselves unless you step back and allow yourself to see the whole. And I found myself returning to that same feeling again, that quiet confusion, that moment where certainty dissolves and all that's left is a question that doesn't demand an immediate answer. Why do they do this? Not in a way that expects resolution, but in a way that invites observation, that allows space for not knowing. Because maybe that's where understanding actually begins. Not with answers, but with the willingness to sit with something that doesn't fit and to accept that life in all its forms doesn't need to align with what I expect in order to function. It simply exists, adapting, evolving, expressing itself in ways that feel unfamiliar until slowly, over time, they begin to make sense. Not because they've changed, but because I have. For a long time, I believed something that felt almost obvious, that survival belonged to the strongest, the fastest, the most powerful, that in nature, dominance was the rule, and everything else simply adapted around it. And in many ways, that idea makes sense. It's simple, it's easy to understand, it gives structure to something that otherwise feels unpredictable. But the deeper I looked, the more that idea began to fall apart. Not suddenly, not all at once, but quietly through small details that didn't fit the pattern until eventually it became impossible to ignore, because what I started seeing wasn't strength, it wasn't speed, it wasn't power in the way I had imagined. It was something else entirely, something far less obvious, but far more effective. And it began with something I almost missed. Something so subtle, so still, that if I hadn't been looking carefully, I would have walked past it without noticing at all. A frog resting on a leaf, but not in the way I expected. Its body nearly invisible, its skin translucent that I could see through it, faint outlines of organs, bones, even the quiet rhythm of its heartbeat, visible beneath the surface. And for a moment, it didn't feel real, because animals aren't supposed to disappear like that. They're supposed to stand out, to move, to react, to assert their presence in some way. But this one did the opposite. It didn't move, it didn't signal, it didn't defend itself. It simply existed in a state of near invisibility, blending so completely into its environment that it became part of the background. And I remember thinking, this doesn't look like survival. This looks like absence, like something choosing not to exist in the way I understand it. And yet, that was exactly what kept it alive. Not strength, not speed, but the ability to go unnoticed, to become something that predators don't recognize as prey. And that idea stayed with me. But it wasn't the only example, because later I saw something else, something that challenged my expectations in a completely different way. At first glance, it looked like a snake, coiled, still positioned in a way that felt intentional, watching, waiting. And instinctively, I reacted the way anyone would, cautious, alert, ready to step back, because the shape alone was enough to trigger something deep, something automatic. But then, slowly, the illusion began to break. The proportions weren't quite right. The movement didn't match. The head didn't move at all. And that's when I realized it wasn't a snake, it was a caterpillar. Its body shaped in a way that mimicked something far more dangerous, false eye spots positioned where a head should be, its form narrowing in a way that suggested something else entirely. And suddenly, what I thought I understood about it changed, because this wasn't an animal trying to overpower anything. It wasn't trying to escape. It wasn't even trying to hide completely. It was doing something much more subtle. It was manipulating perception, creating hesitation, just enough doubt, just enough confusion to survive. And I stood there thinking about both of these examples: the frog that disappears, the caterpillar that pretends to be something it isn't. And I realized something that felt both simple and deeply unsettling. That survival in nature isn't about being the best in absolute terms. It's about being the most appropriate, the most aligned with the environment you exist within. Because strength only works when it's needed. Speed only matters when there's space to move. But in environments where visibility means danger, where recognition means death, the most effective strategy is not to stand out, but to blend in, to distort, to mislead. And that realization forced me to question something I had carried for a long time. The idea that success in any form comes from being more powerful, more visible, more dominant. Because here, in these quiet, almost invisible interactions, I was seeing something entirely different, something that doesn't rely on excess, something that works through precision, through subtlety, through an understanding of how others perceive you. And the more I thought about it, the more I began to see how limited my original perspective had been. How focused it was on obvious traits, on things that can be easily measured, easily compared, while ignoring the deeper layer, the context, the environment, the conditions that define what actually works. And I found myself returning to a thought that felt increasingly clear: that in nature, there is no universal advantage, no single trait that guarantees survival. There is only alignment, only the ability to match what is needed when it is needed in the place where it matters. And maybe that's why these examples stayed with me longer than anything else, because they revealed something that isn't immediately visible, something that doesn't announce itself, something that only becomes clear when you stop looking for dominance and start looking for balance. And in that moment, I honestly definitive that it's not the strongest that survives, it's not the fastest, it's not the most aggressive, it's the one that fits, the one that adapts, the one that becomes exactly what the environment requires, even if that means becoming invisible, even if that means becoming something else entirely, even if that means letting go of everything I once believed survival was supposed to be. There was a time when I thought of nature as a collection of separate lives, individual animals, individual events, each one moving through its own path, its own struggle, its own survival. And in that view, everything felt fragmented, disconnected, like a series of small stories happening side by side, but never truly touching until I started to notice something that didn't fit that picture. Something that didn't belong to any single animal, but instead existed between them. Something that only became visible when I stopped focusing on individuals and began to look at the connections. And it began with something that felt simple at first: a river, cold, clear, cutting through a landscape shaped by glaciers. And within that river, movement, thousands, then millions of fish pushing upstream, not drifting, not wandering, but moving with direction, with purpose, returning to a place they had never seen, at least not in their own lifetime. Salmon leaving the ocean, entering freshwater, driven by something internal, something precise enough to guide them back to the exact streams where they were born. And I remember watching them struggle against the current, leaping over rocks, forcing their bodies upward through narrow channels, exhausting themselves in a journey that had only one outcome: they would not return. This was a one-way movement, a final act. And at first it looked like sacrifice, like something that didn't quite make sense. Why would something evolve to end its life this way, to give everything it has just to reach a place where it will stop? But then I looked beyond the fish. And I started to see something else, shapes standing in the water, large, still waiting, bears, positioned at the base of waterfalls, not chasing, not searching, just standing, letting the movement come to them. And suddenly, what looked like a single event became part of something larger. The fish leap, the bear barely moves, the outcome is almost inevitable. And what happens next is even more revealing. Because the bear doesn't consume everything, it takes what it needs. The richest parts, the brain, the skin, the roe, and the rest is left behind, scattered along the riverbanks, carried into the forest, where something else begins. Nutrients from the ocean transported inland, feeding insects, feeding plants, feeding the soil itself. And I realized something in that moment. The fish are not just feeding the bear, they are feeding the forest. They are carrying energy from one world into another, connecting two systems that would otherwise remain separate. And what I was seeing wasn't just behavior, it was transfer, movement of life, from ocean to river to land, through a process that doesn't belong to any single organism, but depends on all of them. And then there was another example, different landscape, different species, but the same underlying pattern. Wolves moving through open terrain, not in chaos, not in random pursuit, but with structure, with awareness of the herd they are following. Elk, grazing, moving slowly, unaware of how their behavior shapes everything around them. And for a long time, I thought of predators as controllers, as dominant forces shaping the environment through direct action, through hunting, through reducing numbers. But what I began to understand was something far more subtle, something less visible. The presence of wolves changes how the elk behave, not just how many there are, but where they go, how long they stay, how they move through the landscape, and that change spreads outward. Because when the elk stop lingering in certain areas, vegetation has time to recover, plants grow along riverbanks, roots stabilize the soil, water flows differently, and suddenly what began as a predator-prey relationship becomes something much larger, something that reshapes the entire ecosystem. And I stood there thinking about both of these systems, the salmon moving upstream, the bears feeding, the forest absorbing what remains, the wolves influencing the movement of herds, the land responding in ways that aren't immediately obvious. And I realized something that felt almost impossible to ignore, that nothing here exists in isolation. Not the fish, not the bear, not the trees, not the predator, not the prey. Every action, every movement, every behavior is part of something that extends beyond itself. Something that connects systems across distance, across environments, across scales that I hadn't been paying attention to before. And the idea of independence, of separate existence, began to feel incomplete, almost inaccurate, because what I was seeing wasn't a collection of individual lives, it was a network, a system, something that operates more like a machine than I had ever imagined, not mechanical, not rigid, but interconnected, responsive, where a change in one part echoes through everything else, sometimes slowly, sometimes in ways that are almost invisible, but always present. And I found myself questioning something I had always assumed, that life is about individual survival, about isolated success, about each organism finding its own way. But now that idea felt too small, too narrow, because survival here wasn't happening alone. It was happening together through relationships, through dependencies, through interactions that don't always look significant on the surface, but carry consequences far beyond what I can immediately see. And that realization stayed with me, not as a sudden conclusion, but as something that settled gradually, a shift in perspective that made everything else feel different. Because once you see these connections, once you understand that every part of a system influences the others, it becomes impossible to look at anything in isolation again. And I couldn't help but think, maybe nothing in this world truly stands alone. Maybe everything from the smallest movement to the largest migration, is part of something that extends beyond itself. Something that connects, that balances, that sustains. And that what I had been seeing all along wasn't separate lives, but a single system expressing itself through many forms, moving, adapting, continuing, in ways that don't need to be obvious to be real, and don't need to be understood completely to exist. There was a point in this journey where I stopped asking whether something was possible and started asking how far life is willing to go, because what I began to see didn't feel limited anymore. It didn't feel constrained by what I thought survival should look like. It felt open, expansive, as if life itself was constantly testing the edges of what it could become. And one of the clearest moments of that came when I saw movement on a scale I had never imagined before. Not a few animals, not a scattered group, but a continuous flow, stretching across the horizon, thousands, then hundreds of thousands, then more. An entire landscape in motion, the Serengeti, where over 1 million wildebeest move together, not randomly, not without direction, but following something invisible. Something that shifts with the seasons, fresh grass, water, conditions that change just enough to force movement. And I remember watching them from a distance, the ground itself almost disappearing beneath the density of bodies, dust rising into the air, forming clouds that follow the herd as it moves. And at first, it felt overwhelming, too large to fully process, but then I began to notice the details. The hesitation at the edges, the sudden surges of motion, the way the entire group responds almost instantly to subtle changes. And I realized that what I was seeing wasn't just migration, it was persistence, movement driven by necessity, not choice, because staying still here isn't an option. The environment doesn't allow it. The resources shift, the conditions change, and the only way to survive is to move with them. And that movement isn't easy. It's not safe. It's filled with risk. Rivers that must be crossed, currents that sweep animals away, predators waiting at narrow points where the herd has no choice but to pass. And yet the movement continues. Not because it's perfect, not because every individual succeeds, but because enough of them do, enough to sustain the system, continue the cycle. And that was the first realization, that survival isn't about eliminating risk, it's about continuing despite it. And then I saw something completely different, but carrying the same underlying truth in the open ocean, where the water feels endless, where there are no boundaries, no clear structures. I watched as massive shapes moved just beneath the surface, manta rays, wide, graceful, their wings spanning several meters, gliding through the water with a kind of effortlessness that feels almost unreal. And what struck me wasn't their size, it was their behavior. They weren't hunting in the way I expected, they weren't aggressive, they weren't pursuing prey in bursts of speed or force. They were filtering, feeding on plankton, some of the smallest forms of life in the ocean. And I remember thinking, something this large, this powerful in appearance, surviving on something so small, so abundant, so easy to overlook. And it challenged another assumption I had carried, that strength requires dominance, that size implies control. But here that relationship didn't hold, because survival wasn't coming from overpowering anything, it was coming from alignment, from finding a resource that is constant, that doesn't require competition, that allows movement without conflict. And then there were the jellyfish, drifting through enclosed waters, millions of them pulsing gently, filling entire lakes with movement that felt almost synchronized. And what made it even more unusual was what they lacked, their sting. Something that defines most of their kind, something that protects them, that makes them dangerous. Had faded over generations, because in this isolated environment there were no predators, no need for defense, and instead of holding on to a trait that was no longer necessary, it simply disappeared. And that was the second realization that survival doesn't require perfection. It doesn't require holding on to every advantage. It requires adaptation, the ability to change, to let go of what is no longer needed, to become something that fits the conditions you exist within. And standing there, thinking about these different forms of life, the herds moving across vast plains, the rays gliding through open water, the jellyfish drifting in complete safety. I began to see a pattern that connected all of them, not through similarity, but through flexibility, because none of them were perfect. None of them were built to dominate every situation. But each of them, in their own way, had found a balance, a way to exist within the constraints of their environment, without needing to control it, without needing to reshape it entirely. And that realization stayed with me because it challenged something deeper than just how animals survive. It challenged how I think about success, about strength, about what it means to endure. Because I had always associated survival with control, with overcoming, with imposing structure on the environment. But here, survival looked different. It looked like movement, like adjustment, like responding rather than resisting. And I found myself thinking, maybe life doesn't need to be perfect to continue. Maybe it just needs to be adaptable, responsive, willing to change when the conditions shift. And that thought felt both simple and unexpectedly profound because it removed something I hadn't noticed I was carrying. The expectation that survival should look strong, should look controlled, should look intentional in a way that aligns with how I understand the world. And instead, it revealed something quieter, something more fluid, that life doesn't aim for perfection, it aims for continuity. And it achieves that not by becoming the strongest, but by becoming what is needed, when it is needed, in the place where it exists. And maybe that's why these moments felt so different, because they didn't just show me what life can do, they showed me how little it needs to succeed, as long as it remains willing to adapt. There are places in this world where your sense of direction quietly begins to fail, not because you're lost, but because the rules you rely on to understand space, distance, and reality itself stop behaving the way you expect. And I remember standing there, looking out across what should have been solid ground, a vast expanse stretching in every direction, flat, endless, silent, and yet something felt off. Because the ground beneath my feet wasn't behaving like ground anymore. It was reflecting perfectly, almost unnaturally. The sky above me, clouds drifting slowly, mirrored below with such clarity that the horizon began to dissolve, and for a moment, I couldn't tell where the earth ended and where the sky began. Salar de Uyuni, a place I had seen in images before, a place I thought I understood, until I was actually there. Standing on what felt like a surface that didn't belong to this world because everything about it challenged the way I normally perceive space. The flatness was absolute, over 10,000 square kilometers of hardened salt, nearly level to a degree that feels impossible at a human scale. No hills, no variation, no landmarks to anchor your sense of depth. And then, when the conditions are just right, when a thin layer of water spreads across that surface, something extraordinary happens. The ground disappears, not fears, not physically, but perceptually, because the water is shallow enough to remain still, undisturbed, acting like a single continuous mirror, reflecting everything above it with almost perfect symmetry. And I remember taking a step forward, expecting resistance, expecting the usual feedback from the world beneath me. But instead, it felt like I was walking into something else entirely, like stepping into the sky itself, each movement creating ripples that briefly break the illusion, only for it to return again, smooth, uninterrupted, endless. And I looked down and saw clouds beneath my feet, not distorted, not abstract, but clear, defined, as if I was suspended between two identical worlds, one above, one below. And neither of them felt more real than the other. And that was the moment that unsettled me. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because it removed something I didn't realize I depended on. The ability to orient myself, to know where I am in relation to everything else. Because normally, the horizon separates things, defines the boundary between land and sky. It gives structure to what we see. But here, that boundary disappears, and without it, depth collapses, distance becomes difficult to judge, objects appear closer or farther than they actually are, and even the act of walking begins to feel slightly disconnected from reality. And I found myself slowing down, not because I needed to, but because something in me hesitated, as if my body was trying to recalibrate, trying to find a reference point that no longer existed. And the more I stood there, the more I realized that what I was experiencing wasn't just visual, it was cognitive, a disruption of the way my mind processes the world. Because I rely on patterns, on consistent relationships between surfaces, between light, between distance, and here, those patterns were no longer reliable. They had been replaced by something else, something that doesn't follow the same rules. And I began to understand that this place wasn't creating an illusion, it was revealing a limitation, showing me how dependent I am on certain visual cues to construct reality, and what happens when those cues are removed. And that realization stayed with me, because it wasn't just about the reflection, it wasn't just about the beauty of the scene, it was about the moment where certainty breaks down, where what feels solid becomes uncertain, where what looks obvious becomes questionable. And I couldn't help but think how much of what I consider real is based on assumptions I've never examined, patterns I've accepted without question, because they've always worked until now, until a place like this quietly removes them and forces me to experience something different, something that doesn't offer clear answers, something that doesn't resolve into a stable image, but instead leaves me suspended between two possibilities, both equally convincing, both equally real. And as I stood there, watching the sky repeat itself beneath me, stretching endlessly in both directions, I realized something that felt both simple and deeply disorienting, that reality, at least the way I perceive it, isn't as fixed as I thought. It's constructed, shaped by the conditions around me, by the information my senses provide, and when those conditions change, even slightly, everything else begins to shift with it. And maybe that's why places like this feel so powerful, because they don't just show you something new, they change how you see everything else. And for a moment, standing there between sky and earth, I couldn't tell which one I belonged to. Or if that distinction even mattered anymore. I used to think water was one of the simplest things to understand. It flows, it mixes, it follows gravity, it adapts to whatever shape contains it. Predictable, consistent, almost passive in the way it behaves. And for most of my life, that assumption held until I saw something that didn't fit, something that quietly broke that logic without making a sound. Two rivers, meeting, touching, moving side by side. And yet, not mixing, not blending, not becoming one. And I remember staring at that boundary, a clear line, visible even from above, one side dark, almost black, the other a sandy brown, both moving forward, both flowing with equal certainty, but refusing to merge, as if something invisible was holding them apart. And my first reaction, instinctive, immediate, was confusion. Because water doesn't behave like that. It shouldn't behave like that. When two bodies of water meet, they combine, they lose their identity, they become something new. But here, that didn't happen. Not right away. Not for several kilometers. And I kept asking myself, what am I missing? What am I not seeing? Because the surface looked calm, almost ordinary. But beneath that calm, something more complex was happening. Differences in temperature, differences in speed, differences in density and chemical composition, all interacting in ways that slowed the process of mixing, not stopping it entirely, but delaying it, creating a temporary boundary, a moment where two systems coexist without merging, and that moment stretched longer than I expected, long enough to feel deliberate. Long enough to feel like a contradiction. And it made me pause, because if something as fundamental as water, something I thought I understood so completely, could behave this way under the right conditions, then maybe it was never as simple as I believed. Maybe I had only seen it in its most common form and assumed that was all it could be. And then there was another place, quieter, more enclosed, but carrying the same sense of disorientation, a perfectly round opening in the earth, still calm, almost inviting at first glance, the surface of the water undisturbed, reflecting light in a way that made it look almost solid. And I remember standing at the edge, looking down, expecting to see something shallow, something contained, but instead there was depth, not just physical depth, but something that felt more layered, more hidden. The water so clear that it revealed everything beneath it. Rock formations, shafts of light cutting through the darkness, particles suspended in the water like slow-moving dust. And for a moment, it felt like I was looking into something that didn't belong to the surface world. A cenote, an entrance into a network that exists beneath the ground, where water doesn't flow in open rivers but moves through tunnels, through chambers carved slowly into limestone over thousands of years. And what struck me wasn't just the clarity, it was the stillness. Because unlike rivers, unlike oceans, there was no visible movement, no current, no waves, just depth, quiet, uninterrupted. And yet, I knew it wasn't still. I knew that beneath that calm surface, water was moving slowly, invisibly, through spaces I couldn't see, connecting systems that stretched for hundreds of kilometers beneath the forest above. And I began to realize something that felt both subtle and significant. That water doesn't always reveal how it behaves. It doesn't always show its movement. Sometimes it flows in ways that are hidden, delayed, shaped by environments that don't match what I expect. And standing there, thinking about both of these places, the rivers that meet but don't mix, the pools that appear still but connect to vast underground systems, I felt that same shift again. That quiet adjustment in how I understand something I thought was simple. Because water isn't just a substance that moves from one place to another. It is a system, responsive, adaptable, shaped by conditions that change how it behaves. Sometimes dramatically, sometimes in ways that are almost invisible. And the more I thought about it, the more I began to see how limited my original understanding had been, how much of it was based on what I had observed in familiar environments, in controlled conditions, where water behaves in ways that are easy to predict, easy to explain, but outside of that, outside of those boundaries, it becomes something else. Something more complex, something that doesn't always follow the patterns I rely on. And I found myself returning to a thought that felt increasingly clear. That even something as fundamental as water, something I've encountered every day of my life, is far more intricate than I ever considered. And maybe that's the pattern I've been seeing all along, that nothing in this world is as simple as it first appears. That every system, no matter how familiar, holds layers of behavior that only reveal themselves under the right conditions. And that what I've been calling understanding has often just been familiarity, a surface-level recognition that doesn't account for the full complexity beneath. And standing there, looking at water that refused to behave the way I expected, I realized something that felt both grounding and unsettling at the same time. That simplicity is often just a reflection of limited perspective, and that the deeper I look, the more that simplicity begins to dissolve, revealing something far more intricate, far more dynamic, and far more difficult to fully grasp than I had ever imagined. I remember the first time I saw it, I didn't question it at all. The image was too clear, too convincing, the ocean itself pouring downward as if the edge of the world had finally been revealed, water cascading into a deep abyss beneath the surface, a massive underwater waterfall. And for a moment, it felt undeniable, because everything about it matched what I expected a waterfall to look like. Movement, depth, contrast, light fading into darkness. All the visual cues were there, and my mind accepted it instantly, without hesitation, without doubt, because it made sense, or at least it appeared to. But something about that moment stayed with me. Not because it was extraordinary, but because of how quickly I believed it. How easily my perception aligned with what I was seeing, without asking whether it was actually real. And that's when I began to look closer, not just at the image, but at the conditions that created it. Because what I was seeing wasn't water falling into the earth, it was something else entirely. Something quieter, something that didn't rely on force or gravity in the way I imagined. Mauritius sits on a shallow underwater plateau, surrounded by a sudden drop into much deeper ocean, and along that edge, sand and sediment are constantly being pulled downward, slipping off the shelf into the depths below, creating trails, soft gradients of color that shift from bright turquoise to deep blue, and from above, when viewed from the right angle, those trails align in a way that mimics the movement of falling water, creating an illusion so complete, so precise, that it overrides everything else. And I found myself sitting with that realization, not just understanding it, but reflecting on what it revealed. Because the illusion didn't exist on its own. It depended on perspective, on distance, on light, on the position of the observer, and without those conditions, it disappears completely, revealing something far less dramatic, far more subtle, and yet no less real. And that's when something shifted again, because I realized that what I see, what I trust, what I accept as reality is often shaped by incomplete information, by patterns my mind has learned to recognize and apply automatically without question. Waterfalls fall, depth looks like darkness, movement implies direction. And when those elements appear together, I don't analyze them, I accept them instantly. And standing there, thinking about that illusion, I began to see how fragile that process really is, how easily it can be influenced, how quickly it can lead to certainty that isn't fully justified. And I started to wonder, how many other things have I seen this way? How many times have I accepted something as real, not because I understood it, but because it fit a pattern I was already familiar with? And the more I thought about it, the more it became clear that perception isn't just about what is there. It's about how we interpret what is there, how we connect shapes, colors, movements into something that feels meaningful, something that feels coherent. And in doing so, we often create a version of reality that isn't entirely accurate, but feels convincing enough to accept. And that realization stayed with me, not as a correction, but as a shift in awareness. Because it didn't make the illusion less interesting, it made it more meaningful. Because now, it wasn't just something to look at, it was something that revealed the limits of my own perception. Something that showed me how easily reality can be constructed and how quickly it can dissolve when viewed from a different angle. And I found myself returning to a thought that felt both simple and difficult to ignore. That not everything I see is exactly what it appears to be. That the world doesn't always present itself in a way that aligns with my expectations. And that sometimes what feels most real, most obvious, most certain is actually the result of conditions I don't fully understand. And standing there, imagining that underwater landscape, the slow movement of sand slipping into deeper water, the gradients of color shifting beneath the surface, I realized something that felt quietly profound, that reality isn't always something fixed, something absolute. It's something experienced, something shaped by perspective, by position, by the way I happen to encounter it in that moment. And maybe that's why places like this feel so powerful, because they don't just show us something unusual. They show us how easily we can be convinced, how quickly we can trust what we see, and how important it is to pause, to question, to look a little closer, because sometimes what we're looking at isn't wrong, it's just incomplete. And sometimes the truth exists just beneath the surface, waiting for us to notice it if we're willing to see beyond the first impression. There are places I've seen where the first thought that comes to mind isn't curiosity, it's disbelief. Not because they are hidden, not because they are rare, but because they don't look like they belong here. And I remember standing there in a place so quiet, so still that it felt disconnected from everything I had experienced before. The ground beneath me, not soil, not sand, but a pale, cracked surface, almost white, stretching outward like something dried long ago and never touched again, and rising from that surface, shapes that didn't feel alive, but weren't entirely gone either. Trees, tall, black, twisted, standing in place, exactly where they had once grown. And for a moment, I couldn't understand what I was looking at, because they didn't look like trees in the way I recognized them. There were no leaves, no movement, no sign of decay, just dark silhouettes against a bright, almost blinding ground, as if time had stopped around them and left them there, untouched. And I remember thinking, this doesn't feel like Earth. This feels like something abandoned, something left behind after everything else disappeared. Dead Fly, a place where a river once flowed, where life once existed, where trees once grew normally, until the environment shifted. Sand dunes slowly moved, blocking the path of water, cutting off the source that sustained everything. And without water, the trees died, but they didn't decay, they didn't collapse, because the air is so dry, so completely devoid of moisture, that the process of decomposition never fully began, leaving them preserved, not as living things, but as structures. Frozen in a moment that ended hundreds of years ago, and standing there, surrounded by these blackened forms, I felt something I hadn't expected, not just awe, but a kind of stillness that felt almost absolute, because nothing here seemed to be changing, nothing seemed to be moving. And yet, I knew that wasn't true, because beyond that quiet surface, something else was happening, something slower, something less visible, but just as powerful. And that's when I looked beyond the trees toward the dunes themselves, massive, rising from the desert floor, some reaching heights of over 300 meters, their surfaces smooth, curved, shaped continuously by the wind. And I watched as grains of sand moved, not in waves, not in sudden bursts, but in a steady, almost imperceptible flow, each particle shifting position, contributing to a form that is never truly fixed, never truly complete. And I realized something that felt almost contradictory, because while the trees stood still, unchanged for centuries, the dunes around them were constantly moving, constantly reshaping, erasing and rebuilding their own structure with every passing moment. And it created a tension between stillness and movement, between what appears frozen and what is actually changing. And I began to see how easily those two states can exist together, how something can look permanent while everything around it continues to evolve. And that's when it became clear why this place felt so unfamiliar, why it felt disconnected from the rest of the world, because it exists at the edge of what I understand as normal, where the processes I expect to see, growth, decay, movement, don't behave the way I'm used to, and instead, they create something that feels almost otherworldly, not because it belongs to another planet, but because it operates under conditions I rarely encounter. And that realization stayed with me, because it wasn't just about the landscape, it was about perception again, about how quickly I label something as unfamiliar, as alien, simply because it doesn't align with my everyday experience. And I started to wonder, how many other places exist like this, places that feel disconnected, not because they are different, but because I haven't spent enough time understanding them and surrounded by silence, by forms that felt both present and absent at the same time. I felt that shift again, that quiet adjustment in how I see the world. Because now, I couldn't rely on familiarity to guide my understanding. I couldn't assume that what feels normal is universal, and I couldn't dismiss something as unreal simply because it looks different. And I found myself thinking, maybe there are parts of this world that will always feel foreign, not because they are beyond explanation, but because they exist outside the patterns I'm used to seeing. And maybe that's what makes them so powerful, because they remind me that this planet is not defined by what I recognize. It's defined by processes that continue regardless of my understanding. And sometimes those processes create places that feel so distant, so disconnected, that the only way to describe them is to say they don't look like Earth at all, even though they are right here beneath my feet. Part of the same world I thought I already knew. There was a point in this journey where the question changed again. No longer about what exists, no longer about how the world works, but about where we as humans actually belong within it. Because up until then, I had been observing, learning, adjusting my understanding of what I thought was possible, but I still carried something subtle, something invisible, the assumption that we are always part of the environment. That no matter how extreme a place may seem, we can eventually adapt to it, explore it, stand within it, and call it ours. But that idea began to unravel the moment I thought about a place where even standing still becomes a negotiation, where every breath requires effort, where the body itself begins to fail, not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, quietly, one function at a time, Mount Everest. The highest point on Earth, something I had always associated with achievement, with endurance, with the idea of reaching the top. But the more I understood what exists above a certain altitude, the more that idea began to shift, because beyond 8,000 meters, there is a zone, often called the death zone, where the human body cannot survive for long, no matter how trained, no matter how prepared, and no matter how determined. And I remember trying to process that, because it challenges something fundamental, the belief that with enough effort, enough discipline, enough will, anything can be overcome. But here that belief doesn't hold because the environment itself doesn't allow it. The air is too thin. Oxygen levels drop so low that even simple movement becomes exhausting. The body begins to shut down, cells starve, decisions slow, coordination fades, and every step forward is not progress, but a trade, time for altitude, survival for proximity to the summit. And I found myself thinking, this isn't a place meant to be lived in. It's not even a place meant to be endured for long. It's a boundary, a limit, a point where the conditions of the earth no longer align with the requirements of the human body. And that realization stayed with me because it wasn't just about Everest. It was about the idea that there are places on this planet that exist completely outside of our range, places where our presence is temporary by necessity, not by choice. And then there was another place, one that felt completely different, and yet carried the same underlying truth. Antarctica, vast, silent, covered in ice that stretches beyond what the eye can fully comprehend. A landscape defined not by features, but by absence. No cities, no permanent human settlements, no structures that exist without constant support. And I remember imagining what it would feel like to stand there, surrounded by nothing but white, the horizon blending into the sky, distance becoming impossible to judge. Wind moving across the surface with a force that feels almost mechanical, temperatures dropping to levels that don't just feel cold, but actively resist life itself. And I realized something that felt difficult to fully accept, that survival in a place like this is not natural. It is constructed, dependent on equipment, on planning, on systems designed to counteract the environment, and without those systems, and without that layer of artificial support, The human body it cannot adapt quickly enough. It cannot function in a way that allows continuity. And that's when the realization became clear, not as a dramatic statement, but as something quiet, something that settled slowly, that there are places in this world where we do not belong, not because we lack the will to be there, but because the conditions themselves do not accommodate us. And that idea felt different from anything I'd considered before, because it removes something subtle, something we often assume without noticing. The idea that the earth is structured around us, that environments exist within a range that we can eventually inhabit, but here that assumption doesn't apply because these places exist independently of us and shaped by forces that don't consider our presence, don't adjust to our needs, don't change to accommodate our survival. And standing there, thinking about both of these extremes, the thin air of Everest, the frozen expanse of Antarctica, I felt something shift again, not in what I understood, but in how I positioned myself within it, because now I couldn't see humanity as central to every environment. And I couldn't assume that every part of this world was meant to be experienced in the same way. And I began to understand something that felt both limiting and strangely grounding, that we are not separate from nature, but we are not universally compatible with it either. We exist within a specific range, a set of conditions where life functions, where systems align, where survival is possible without constant resistance. And beyond that range, there are places that continue without us, that operate on their own terms, that remain unchanged, regardless of whether we can reach them or not. And maybe that's what makes them so powerful, because they remind us of something we rarely consider, that this world is not defined by what we can inhabit, but by what exists beyond our reach, and that there are boundaries, not just physical, but biological, that define where we belong and where we don't. And for the first time, I didn't see that as a limitation. I saw it as a perspective, a way of understanding that the Earth is larger, more complex, and less centered around us than I had ever imagined. And that realization, quiet as it was, changed the way I see everything that comes after. There was a moment, subtle at first, almost easy to overlook, where I began to understand something that felt both obvious and difficult to accept, that control, the kind we assume we have over our environment, is often an illusion, not because we never shape the world around us, but because there are forces operating at scales and intensities that don't respond to anything we do. And I remember thinking about a storm. Not the kind that passes quickly, not the kind that disrupts and disappears, but something larger, something organized, a system that builds itself in the sky, slowly, deliberately, drawing energy from differences we barely notice, warm air rising, cold air descending, wind moving at different speeds across different layers, and somewhere within that interaction, something begins to form, a supercell. A structure so vast that it dominates everything beneath it, rotating, sustained, not drifting randomly, but holding its position, as if anchored to something invisible. And I tried to imagine what it would feel like to stand beneath it, to look up and see a sky that isn't just dark, but alive, moving with purpose, lightning fracturing through the clouds, rain falling in concentrated shafts, hail forming and dropping with force that feels almost mechanical. And within that system, something even more focused can emerge, a tornado, a column of air connecting sky and ground, rotating with a precision that feels almost engineered, but isn't. And I realized something in that moment, that this isn't chaos in the way I usually think about it. It's structure, but a structure that doesn't include me, doesn't adjust for me, doesn't recognize my presence at all. And that's what made it feel different, because no matter who you are, no matter how prepared, no matter how aware, standing in the path of something like that doesn't change the outcome. The system continues, unaffected, following its own logic, its own dynamics, completely independent of anything happening at a human scale. and that realization stayed with me. But it wasn't the only place where that idea became clear, because there was another environment, one that felt almost opposite in appearance, but carried the same underlying truth. The Sahara, vast, open, stretching beyond what I could fully comprehend, dunes repeating endlessly, horizons blurred by heat, distance becoming unreliable, and I remember imagining what it would feel like to move through that space. Not for a moment, not for a short experience, but for long enough that the environment begins to shape your perception, your decisions, your ability to continue. Because in a place like that, there are no clear markers, no consistent references. The landscape shifts with the wind. Patterns repeat until they become indistinguishable, and the sun, constant, unrelenting, removes the contrast that helps define space. And I realize that the challenge here isn't sudden, it's gradual. It builds quietly: dehydration, disorientation, the slow loss of energy, not through a single event, but through accumulation. And what struck me most was how little the environment changes in response to anything. It doesn't adjust, it doesn't soften, it doesn't respond to presence. It remains exactly as it is, regardless of who enters it. And that's when the connection between these two places became clear. The storm and the desert, completely different in form. One dynamic, one seemingly still, but both operating under the same principle, that the environment defines the conditions, not the individual. And I began to understand something that felt both simple and absolute, that nature doesn't negotiate, it doesn't adapt to our expectations. It doesn't respond to effort or intention. It exists according to processes that don't include us as a central factor. And that idea challenged something I hadn't fully recognized before: the assumption that with enough awareness, enough preparation, enough knowledge, we can always find a way to manage the conditions we face. But here, that assumption doesn't hold completely, because while preparation can extend survival, while knowledge can improve outcomes, it doesn't change the fundamental reality that these systems operate on their own terms. And I found myself reflecting on that, not as a limitation, but as a shift in perspective, because it changes how I think about control, about influence, about the relationship between human action and natural processes. And I began to see that what we often call control is actually navigation. Working within conditions that already exist, rather than shaping them entirely. And that realization felt grounding in a way I didn't expect, because it removes something subtle: the pressure to dominate, the expectation to overcome every environment, and replaces it with something quieter. An understanding that there are systems larger than us, more complex than us, and entirely independent of us. And that within those systems, our role is not to dictate, but to adapt, to observe, to move carefully within the boundaries they define. And as I thought about the storm rotating above open land and the desert stretching endlessly beneath a silent sky, I couldn't help but return to a thought that felt increasingly clear: that nature doesn't care who I am. It doesn't recognize status, intention, or identity. It responds only to its own processes. And maybe that's what makes it feel so powerful. Not because it opposes us, but because it exists completely outside of us, unaffected, unchanged, continuing exactly as it always has, whether we are there to witness it or not. There are moments when nothing around you feels threatening, nothing feels urgent, and yet something shifts inside you so quietly, so deeply, that it changes how you see everything that comes after. And for me, one of those moments happened not on the ground, not in the ocean, not in any place shaped by terrain, but in the sky, or more precisely, in what the sky became. Because I remember looking up, expecting darkness, expecting stillness, the familiar absence of light that comes with night. But instead, there was movement, slow, fluid, almost impossible to define at first. Ribbons of green stretching across the horizon, folding, bending, dissolving, and reforming again, as if the sky itself had become something alive, something that doesn't stay still long enough to fully understand. The aurora borealis, something I had seen in images, something I thought I recognized, but standing beneath it, it felt completely different. Because no image, no description prepares you for the scale, for the way it occupies the entire sky, not as a fixed display, but as a continuous transformation. Light shifting from one shape to another, patterns forming and disappearing before your mind can fully process them. And I remember trying to follow it, to track the movement, to anticipate where it would go next. But it didn't move in a way I could predict. It didn't follow any path that made sense to me. It simply unfolded, responding to forces that exist far beyond what I can see. Particles traveling from the sun, colliding with Earth's magnetic field, interacting with gases in the atmosphere, producing colors that feel almost too vivid, too precise to be accidental, and yet completely natural, completely beyond control. And that was the moment something changed. Not because I didn't understand the explanation, but because the explanation didn't reduce the experience. It expanded it. Because now, I wasn't just looking at lights in the sky, I was witnessing the interaction between the sun and the earth, an exchange happening across millions of kilometers, invisible most of the time, but revealed in moments like this. And I found myself standing there, not moving, not thinking in the way I usually do, but simply observing, allowing the movement to continue without trying to define it, without trying to place it into something familiar. And I realized something that felt difficult to put into words, that what I was seeing wasn't meant to be understood in a complete sense. It wasn't something I could reduce into a concept and move on from. It was something that existed at a scale, both in distance and in process, that didn't align with the way I normally interpret the world. And for the first time, I felt that clearly, not as an idea, but as a sensation that I am not at the center of what is happening here. I am not influencing it. I am not shaping it. I am simply present, observing something that would continue exactly the same way, whether I was there or not. And that realization didn't feel diminishing. It didn't feel like a loss. It felt grounding because it removed something I hadn't noticed I was carrying. The assumption that everything I experience is somehow connected to me, that my presence matters within every environment I encounter. But here, that wasn't true. The sky moved. The light shifted, the patterns formed and dissolved completely independent of anything I did. And I found that strangely comforting because it allowed me to step back, to exist within the moment without needing to control it, without needing to interpret it fully. And I began to understand something that felt both simple and profound, that I am part of this world, but only a very small part, a participant, not a central force. Someone who experiences, but does not define the processes that shape everything around me. And as I stood there, watching the colors stretch across the sky, expanding beyond what I could see, fading into darkness, only to return again in a different form, I felt that sense of scale more clearly than ever before. Not just the physical scale of the sky, but the scale of the systems that create it. The distance, the energy, the interaction between forces that exist far beyond my immediate environment, and it made everything else feel smaller. Not in a way that diminishes it, but in a way that places it into context, because suddenly, the things I usually focus on, the details that occupy my attention, felt less absolute, less central, compared to something that exists at this level. And I found myself returning to a thought that didn't need to be forced. It simply emerged quietly, naturally, that I am only a small part of something much larger, something that continues, that evolves, that expresses itself in ways I may never fully understand. And that realization didn't create distance, it created connection, because it reminded me that I don't need to control the world to be part of it. I don't need to understand everything to exist within it. I can simply observe, simply experience, and allow myself to be present within something that is far greater than anything I could define, and for the fucking define. And for the first time, that didn't feel limiting. It felt enough. There's something that happens, not all at once, not in a single moment, but slowly, quietly, as you move through everything you've seen, everything you thought you understood, and begin to notice the gaps, the places where your assumptions no longer hold. And I didn't realize when it started, I can't point to a single scene, a single place, and say that was the moment everything changed, because it wasn't like that. It was gradual, almost invisible at first, like something shifting just beneath the surface of awareness, until eventually it becomes clear that the way I saw the world before no longer fits. And I find myself returning to the beginning, to the version of me that believed things were simple, that lakes were just lakes, that mountains were fixed, that animals behaved in ways that could be easily explained, that the ground beneath me was stable, that time was something abstract, something separate from the physical world. And I realize now how limited that view was, not wrong, but incomplete, because everything I've seen since then, every place, every moment, every pattern that revealed itself has pointed to something deeper, something that doesn't fit into simple categories, something that doesn't stop at the surface. And I think about the lake that looked unreal, the pillars that felt like they were floating, the mountain that revealed its colors only after the ice disappeared, the ocean that seemed to fall into itself, the animals that behave in ways I couldn't predict, the systems that connect life across entire ecosystems, the land forming at the edge of the sea, the canyon carved by time itself, the sky moving in ways that remind me how small I am. And I begin to see them not as separate experiences, but as parts of the same realization that the world is not something static, not something finished, not something designed to be fully understood from a single perspective. It is a process, continuous, layered, unfolding in ways that don't need to be obvious to be real. And I realize something else, something that feels both humbling and grounding at the same time, that I have been looking at the world as if it exists for me to understand, as if it should align with my logic, my expectations, my sense of order. But that assumption was never necessary. The world doesn't need to make sense to me. It doesn't need to fit into the patterns I recognize. It simply exists, operating according to forces, interactions, and processes that continue regardless of whether I see them or not. And that realization changes something subtle, but important, because it removes the need to simplify everything, to reduce it into something manageable, something that fits neatly into what I already know. And instead, it creates space to observe, to question, to accept that not everything needs to be resolved immediately. And I find myself thinking about how often I've mistaken familiarity for understanding, how often I've seen something repeatedly and assumed I fully grasped it without ever looking deeper, without ever asking whether there was more beneath what was visible. And now, after everything I've seen, that assumption feels fragile, because I've come to understand that what I notice, what I perceive, what I can, is only a small part of what is actually there, that beneath every surface, there are layers, processes, interactions that remain hidden until the right moment, until the right perspective reveals them. And even then, what is revealed is only partial, only a glimpse. And maybe that's what this entire journey has been about, not learning everything, not reaching a point of complete understandings, but realizing that there is always more depth, more complexity, more connection than I initially see. And that realization doesn't feel overwhelming. It feels grounding, because it changes the goal from trying to understand everything to simply remaining open to what I don't yet understand. And I return again to that thought, the one that feels clearer now than it did at the beginning. This, that I once believed I understood the world, that I could look at something and know what it was, how it worked, where it fit. But now, after everything, that certainty feels different, softer, less absolute, because I see how much of what I thought was complete was only surface level, only the outer layer of something far more intricate, far more dynamic than I had imagined. And I don't see that as a limitation anymore. I see it as an invitation to keep looking, to keep questioning, to keep noticing the details that don't immediately make sense, because those are often the places where something deeper is happening. And as I sit with that, as everything I've seen settles into a quieter understanding, I realize something that feels simple but carries more weight the longer I hold on to it. That I once thought I understood the world, but maybe I've only ever been seeing the surface of it, and everything beyond that is still waiting to be discovered, waiting quietly just beneath what I think I know, waiting for me to look a little closer and see it differently.